chapter 1, so go ahead and jump over to that. As you can see behind me on the board, we're going to do, as I mentioned I think a couple weeks ago when we started this class, we're going to do this class a little bit differently. We're going to take two kind of sections in one. As I mentioned, I think James chapter 1 kind of summarizes the entire book. You may disagree with me, you think that that's completely ridiculous. That's just how I view it, and I think it's a great way to kind of look through it. We will, as we'll go throughout later weeks and this morning a little bit, we'll look at the context leading into it. I'm not a fan of taking anything out of context, so we'll look at the context surrounding these different passages to kind of help us understand them. I just think kind of a different approach to the way we look at James is usually helpful kind of understanding it. I do appreciate Cody for taking care of the class last week. I did watch it, not in real time. I was in services elsewhere. But I did watch it. I thought he did a fantastic job. I thought Dustin also did a fantastic job as well on Sunday morning during the lesson. It was so good that I had several people text me and say, just don't bother coming back. So to those 9 people, I'm sorry to bust your bubble, but I'm here again. I guess you'll have to wait until next time when Dustin and Cody can take over. Before we begin speaking to Cody, though, I'm going to ask him to lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, as we come into this Lord's Day service, we're thankful for each and every one that's able to be here this morning. We're thankful for Brady and his family as he works with us here. We're thankful for each and every one that is able to recover from sickness or be relieved of travel and be back with us and study with us today. We pray that the teachers of this hour may have a ready recollection of the things they have prepared during the week. We're so thankful for the teachers that we have here and the work that they do with our young children as well. We pray that thou will watch over us here as a congregation as we strive to do the things that I will. We pray that thou will watch over us, guide, guard, and direct us in the end go home with thee in heaven. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking at 2 passages. Both of them are up on the board. We're going to take James chapter 1 sequentially throughout the course of this quarter. So we're going to look at verses 2 through 4. Next week we'll look at verses 5 through 7. It's not always just 2 or 3 verses. As we get towards the end of the chapter, we'll kind of take them a verse at a time. That's where kind of this unique breakdown will kind of, like a better phrase, break down a little bit. Because a lot of those verses, especially towards the end, run together. They're one kind of coherent thought. But I think the themes are you can isolate them and look at them and elsewhere. So James chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 is what we're going to look at. We're going to correlate it with James chapter 5 verses 7 through 11. Both of them have to do with the nature of trials. Both of them have to do with the nature of temptation. The idea of perseverance, that's going to be the kind of way that we'll look at it this morning. But we'll look at them individually and we'll kind of put them together. So hopefully it won't be too much jumping around that will confuse everybody. I do want to kind of do a brief rundown of what we discussed 2 weeks ago since it seems like so long ago in the past. We remember, of course, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, and this is not for sure, obviously, but the author is most likely the brother of Jesus. Why is that a noteworthy statement, or why do we think that? Why do we think that the author probably was James, the brother of Jesus? I guess first off, we should ask how many James are there in Scripture? Do we know? There's 5. There's possibly 4, and as we mentioned kind of 2 weeks ago, I put 5 up on the board. There could be 4, depending on whether or not they're 2. James, the son of Alphaeus, is one. That may be also James, the son of Mary. You have James, the brother of John. What other James do you have? James, the brother of Jesus, I guess that's the third one. The fourth one is the most obscure by far. Does anybody remember? That would be James, the brother of John. But yeah, it's the same type of thing. Yeah. There is James, that's the father of somebody. Does anybody remember who that was? James, the father of Judas, which he kind of appears and he just kind of leaves. There's no mention of him besides kind of a designation of Judas, which, by the way, that's got to be the worst kind of designation as a whole, the fact that you're related to him at all. But James, father of Judas, probably was not the one that penned it. Why is it important, though, that it most likely is James, the brother of Jesus? What does that mean? Why is that noteworthy? That's true, we can be sure that it's authentic, yeah?
But also, it gives some reason because his brother, initially he was not a fan of Jesus.
Right.
So
that's a good way to put that.
So this shows that he's come around and changed, and so now he's devoted to Jesus.
Right, and that's one of those stories that I would have loved to know more about. You know, when you look, as Paul mentioned, when you look at the Scriptures, James is one of those figures that seems to have a lot of prominence in Jerusalem. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. He seems to be one of kind of the central leaders. You see that in Acts 15. You see him reappearing in Acts chapter 19, reappearing in Acts chapter 21. When Paul mentions in Galatians 1 that he visits the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, James is one of those people that he talks about. So the idea that James kind of reappears is interesting considering that he was against Jesus, at least initially. As we looked at John chapter 7, not only was he not believing, but what did he want Jesus to do? Do you remember? John chapter 7, he said, "Go into Judea and proclaim yourself to the world." And yet what did he know? Or the brothers know, I guess. Glad my brother is here to hear this, because he tried to also, quote, get me to go into Judea. It's a metaphor, by the way. He tried to get him to go into Judea. What did he also know? Or the brothers know?
He wanted him to more or less out himself.
Yeah.
And Jesus was free.
Well, he wanted to out himself, but he also knew at the beginning of that passage, he knew that the Jews were what? The Jews in Judea were what? Was it longer than 2 weeks? It might have been. Last time.
We were looking to kill him.
They were gunning for him, yes. That is a very good, we're big on metaphors this morning. That's a good point. They were gunning for him. And it mentions that in John chapter 7, the first 3 verses. And then so when it says there in verses 4 through 9, that his brothers are saying, "Go into Judea and proclaim yourself to the world," that kind of doesn't ring very well. It seems like maybe they wanted him to, something to happen to him, maybe they were gunning for him. Regardless of whether there was any malicious intent or not, by the time you get to James, you realize that he was against him originally. Now when you get to the book of James, he's obviously for him. You see James reappearing obviously again in Acts chapter 1. So that's one of those stories that I would have liked to have known a lot about. It's significant, though, if he was in fact the brother of Jesus. We also know that the audience is Messianic Jews scattered around the world. You see that from what he mentions in James chapter 1 and verse 1, when he says to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. The important designation is the Messianic Jews. He's not just talking to any other Jew or to regular Jews, because his message is very much Christ-centered. And so it's not just Jews, it's not just Gentiles, it's people that have a Hebrew background, Jews that are very much attached to Christ. That kind of goes with the next point that we summed up from last week or 2 weeks ago, which is that Old Testament and New Testament ethics are referenced heavily in James. Where do you see this type of idea throughout this book? We brought up a few examples a couple of weeks ago. The idea of James calling either back to the Old Testament or calling back straight to the statements by Jesus, his brother. Do I remember? There's one point where he says, if you remember the royal law, you will do well. And what does he reference as the royal law? Love your neighbor as yourself. Exactly. That's kind of the royal law that he kind of harps on. That's obviously taken from Matthew chapter 22, when Jesus says the 2 laws or the 2 greatest commandments are, first and foremost, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's also an extrapolation of Leviticus 17, Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema as it's called. The greatest commandment is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. You'll see this idea sprinkled throughout our coverage of the book of James. You'll see James referencing, I think next week you'll see him referencing the Beatitudes, you'll see him referencing different parts of the Sermon on the Mount. And so these ideas are all throughout the book of James. And that's one thing I think we need to really grab hold of. What are some of the themes that you see throughout the book of James?
One of the things, which is what I was referring to earlier about authenticity, is that faith works ahead. And of course, that caused a lot of problems back in that day. The faith-only people, I put in Mark Luther, that declared James as a completely only book.
Yeah, actually, to use an Old Testament statement, or an Old statement, he said he was a writhy epistle of straw, which in his day was basically throwing a book at it, yeah.
That's why it's so important that we count it authentic, because one of the themes is that you can't be saved by faith only. Good topic to discuss in today's particular.
That's very true, yeah, and that's where a lot of people kind of get crossways. They love Romans, and if you talk to evangelicals, they love the book of Romans. The hardest part is reconciling with what James says. The difference is Paul is very eloquent when he writes, he's very kind of fluent, he's very kind of flowery, he has a lot of great things to say. James is much more blunt. He just kind of says it as it is, and so the hard part is referencing what Paul says and what people think he means with what James just openly says. We'll discuss that a little bit more in a few weeks. But that is a good point to bring up. It's important that it's authentic, because if it's authentic, we need to listen to it. Yeah?
I'd say one of the big things in James is the testimony of faith.
Right.
Whether it's by partiality, what they say, how they use their money, how they assemble, all these things.
Right. It's the testing of your faith. All the things that he says is important for us to remember, because he talks about perseverance. He talks about all these themes that are important. That kind of goes along with what Paul said. So it is a good idea to kind of see these things in the broader context of the New Testament, if that's what you were talking about. Did you have something? Did I see a hand over here? Okay, what are some other themes Yes, I know I saw it.
Favoritism,
Favoritism is a big one. How so does he talk about favoritism?
don't show favoritism.
That's true.
You know, based on how much dress or whatever he goes through and talks about, people entering your assembly,
Right.
like dress ragged,
Right.
something, instead of moving the back.
Yeah, and that surprisingly, what you're talking about makes up the bulk of his letter. If you look at what James says, and we'll discuss this a little bit more, I think in 2 weeks, when he discusses the idea of favoritism, he says somebody comes into your assembly that's wearing rags, somebody comes into your assembly wearing good clothes, you're going to separate them kind of unconsciously. But God does not do that. And he then delves into that theme a lot. He talks about it a lot in chapter 2, talks about it a lot in chapter 4 or chapter 5. So that type of theme is not only in James, but it's all throughout the New Testament. And that's something we'll explore when we get there. What's the biggest theme, do you think, in the book of James? He does talk about the tongue, yes. How does he talk about the tongue? I thought you were going to say more, I'm sorry. Right, it's hard to tame it. He also mentions in James chapter 1 that if you say your religion is worth something and you can't bridle your tongue, your religion is worthless. So that comes into play as well there. I think the biggest thing when you look at the book of James is just the idea of perseverance. I think Dad mentioned that a little bit ago. The idea of persevering, continuing on, that would have been a very important for the church at Jerusalem. Why? Why would perseverance be such a huge topic for these people?
Because they're undergoing so much persecution.
Right, they're undergoing so much persecution. You remember Acts chapter 7 and 8, that's when Stephen is persecuted. The great persecution, as Acts chapter 11 will talk about, it stems out from Jerusalem. But Jerusalem, especially during this time, is still the epicenter of Jewish thought. It's still where Jesus was crucified. It's still where the persecution kind of spawned out of. And so James is not the leader of the church, because that makes it sound very Catholic. But if he's one of the leading figures, he's one of those that has a lot of influence, what he has to say is going to be very persecution-based. You need to endure because that's what we're all experiencing. Here's how you do it. That kind of makes up the focus of this conversation. Let's look at James chapter 1, starting in verse 2. We'll read these 3 verses before we kind of dive into it. In James chapter 1 and verse 2, he says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." What does James have to say there in those 3 verses? Yes.
Well, we think of trials and tribulation as something that's, we don't like. But,
Right.
But,
I would not call something I like as a trial and a tribulation, yeah. 12-hour video games, that's not really a trial for me.
But he says it's good.
Right.
Show the good comes from it.
Right, and that's exactly right. He talks about something that we all would kind of say is something that's bad. He flips it around and says consider it as something good. And that juxtaposition, to quote Paul's favorite word, that's one of the things that we struggle with. And so when he says consider it all joy in the beginning, he's going to develop that theme throughout the course of these 3 verses. How do you consider it all joy? That's what we'll talk about here in a second. This is one of those books, and James is really big on this, where it'd be very easy to kind of do a word study. I'm sure that's everyone's dream when you talk about Bible studies, just kind of do a Greek word study, hit every single one. We'll try not to do that throughout the course of this study, because I'm not good at it, I don't speak Greek, but I think there are some words here in this passage that kind of jump out at us. The first one that he mentions very simply here is consider. What does he mean when he says consider? He doesn't just think of it. He doesn't just mean think about it. But consider where you're going to lunch. That's not the same type of considering. What does he mean when he says consider? Especially in light of temptation and trial.
Give thought to,
Yeah, give thought to.
think about what's going on.
Think about what's happening, yeah.
What he's saying, it sounds to me like he's saying, kind of plan for it.
Right. Plan for it is too, right. That has the idea of a long thought, or kind of a forethought where you're looking at something. I'm sorry?
You know it's coming.
Right.
So you're planning for it.
Right, which goes back to what Peter said when he says, don't find surprising when you encounter various trials, these things are going to happen. Yeah. Yes.
He's calling for a change of attitude towards trials.
Bingo. Exactly. He's calling for a change of attitude towards these trials. How is it that this change of attitude happens? Because I think that's still within this word of consider. How is it that that change of attitude happens? I don't know why I'm drifting so far this direction. I'm sorry about that. How does that change of attitude happen?
Change of attitude comes based on the thought process that you go through while something like this is happening, thinking about the end result.
Right. And I think you nailed it, especially with that last point. The rest of it, whatever. But I think that especially that last point, That's really gets to the heart of it because, and the rest of what you said was great too, because it all kind of folds into that idea of looking towards something as beyond just the surface, looking at the long-term effects of it, seeing it for what it truly is. And all of that kind of comes into play. So when he says consider it all joy when you fall into various trials, we consider it joy because why? And this maybe dip into what we're talking about here in a minute. But why is it that we consider it all joy? Because what? Well, it contributes to our salvation, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. But why do we consider it all joy? Look at what he says right there in this passage. It matures you. Right. It develops patience. It develops endurance as you go further. Right. What he's getting at when he says consider is don't just look at the surface aspect of it. Don't just see trials and tribulations as being something that's painful right now. That's kind of the way we tend to look at it. But consider it as something deeper. See the meaning behind it. See the purpose behind it. You see this exact same thing in the book of James. In Hebrews. Look in Hebrews chapter 11. It should be all of 3 pages back in your Bible. Hebrews chapter 11 is the big hall of faith. That's the one where the Hebrew writer kind of touches on all these different people. Well, look what he mentions here in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24. He says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than enjoying the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Why does Moses throw his lot in with the Israelites instead of staying in Pharaoh's house? And he would have been, people have estimated around the age of 30, 40, whenever he left Egypt. Why does he make that conscious decision?
He was looking ahead.
He was looking ahead. Why else does he make that decision? Maybe he was looking to the fact that God had made all these promises to Abraham. He's one of those people. He wants to align with them. Why else does he throw his lot in with the Israelites? This is one of those great questions that's really hard to answer. I don't have too many of them, so this is one.
Well, he just says that he considered the reproach of Christ greater than the wealth of the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward.
Right.
So he had a goal in mind. He knew that God was good on his promise, as he had been with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he was able to put that trust in God. And he had seen, if you do what he asks you to do, he rewards that. So he
right. Moses shows, that's exactly right. Moses shows remarkable foresight in this instance because he looks towards the reward. He doesn't just look at, what he gains as a member of Pharaoh's household, which would have been literally anything. Anything would have been at his disposal. He looks towards the long-term reward. He looks towards that growth and the maturation process. Being an Israelite is who he is. So all these things are kind of rolled up into it, but he makes a conscious decision to see beyond just the physical. And so when you jump back to James chapter 1, that's the exact same kind of thing he's asking us to do. Don't look at trials and tribulations as just being the surface thing. Look at it as being something different. He also says, consider it all joy. What does he mean when he says joy? It obviously means that you should post about it on Facebook as a great day in your life. What does he mean when he says, consider it all joy? An inward happiness. Expound on that a little bit. Now I do want to hear what you have to say. You should answer what I'm asking you. What do you mean by an inward happiness? Because that is accurate.
It's something that only you can do. In other words, everybody else is going to think you're happy. They're not going to find that you're happy. It's something that you guys develop in yourself.
Okay, it is something that you have to kind of cultivate yourself, because certainly the trials and temptations are not going to make you happy. I think that's a part of it, yeah. Yes, Debbie.
Well, trials and tribulations are an opportunity for us to remain faithful and
Right.
show our dependence on God.
Right.
And the joy of that is that we have a source of help and a way to get through our tribulations because we have a relationship with God.
Right, and I think that's exactly right. It's an opportunity for us to demonstrate our faith or to kind of prove our faith. Somebody would also say, though, and this is just me playing devil's advocate, somebody would very easily say, well, I'm faithful to God. I don't need the trials. I don't need to be tested. And I think sometimes we look at Abraham. Why was he asked to sacrifice Isaac? Why was that even a possibility? I think the same answer applies to us. Zach, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say that joy here is kind of like when we talk about love. People think of love as an emotion, and emotions are tied to that, but it's an attitude you possess.
Right.
And in this case, joy is an attitude you possess. whenever Paul and Silas were in prison singing, they were joyful, but nobody wants to be locked in prison in stocks. So with that said, the joy here is talking about an attitude you have, not that I'm just going to go around happy all the time, because that is naive to think that.
Right.
But to have that attitude of knowing God approves of what I'm going through, and I can have that peace of mind that God approves of me for going through this, I'm okay with going through it then, and I can rest my hat on that.
Yeah, and I think some people have fallen victim to what you're talking about. It's the idea that when I encounter various trials, I should feel some kind of happy emotion from it. And because we don't feel the happy emotion, we tend to get discouraged because of it. But as you mentioned, it's not something that comes out of us as much as something we plug into it. I consider it joy because I'm growing, because I have opportunities to demonstrate my faith. It's something I'm cultivating. I always use this metaphor because it's obvious that I don't do it, but it's kind of like working out. I don't understand it, but the people that work out, that get up at 3:30 a.m. and work out for 4 hours, love it, even though there's pain involved, because it grows the body, it grows who you are. Yeah, Wiley?
Just something to think about. One of the things I think about with this is the more you have to actively think like that. So when you're going through that time of trial, I liken it to kind of in the military. We always trained when it was raining. Most people get depressed when it rains, but that was when we were being active in training. And now every time it rains, I always have that same thought, that same feeling of excitement, right? So I think the same thing applies to when we're going through trials. If we actively, intentionally are trying to be joyful, knowing what the byproduct of that's is going to be, that will be how we approach it every time we have a trial in our life.
Yeah, well, if you like rain, you must have loved the last couple of months. But yeah, I think that's exactly right. If you understand that it's for something, that you're growing something, there's more to it to that. And so, in a lot of sense, that's what James is trying to get us to understand, is that there's more to it than just the trials. There's a depth to it, there's a growth to it, and all that stuff is what he's talking about. Howard, and then Dustin.
Sort of like accounting, that sounds like a book. Keeping,
I did not do well in school, but yes, accounting is kind of similar.
And this joy of the trials and so forth is something we have to note and right column.
Right. Yeah, I mean, instead of putting it in the unnecessary column, you put it in the necessary. That's just a different, deliberate way of thinking. That's a good point to bring up. Yeah, Dustin.
Well, Paul also says many times in his letters that the churches he's writing to, he talks about how our suffering is also a way that we connect with Christ and his suffering.
Right.
Specifically in Philippians, he talks about how the things I could have had I counted as loss because I want to know the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings.
Right.
It's a mentality of I'm getting to suffer for Christ, and this helps me understand the suffering with Christ by going through the trials and temptations. So if you can understand that part of the mentality, it also helps you with that connection with what Christ had to go through and the trials and temptations that he dealt with also.
Yeah, and I think you see, that's a good point to bring up. I think you see that also in Acts chapter 5 when it says that they were counted worthy to suffer shame. And there's a different, obviously not happy and skipping and all this singing or anything like that, but there's a sense of self-worth, there's a sense of growth, and I think you kind of hit on that. Please, you have something? You also see this, you see it mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 when it talks about the Corinthians able to share in the afflictions and share in the financial support of other congregations, even though they themselves were not necessarily affluent. But it talks about how they were joyful to do that. I think some of that goes back to that fellowship of the sufferings. I think some of that goes back to the ability to help other people to grow through these things. So all of that is kind of imbibed within that idea of joy. But he also mentions trials. And this is something that we need to kind of talk about for just a second. I say just a second, I mean just a second, not 300 seconds. But trials are different than temptations. Temptations are more internal. And he'll talk about temptations later in the book of James. But when he talks about trials, what is he addressing here? You're not saying that I see this and I want it, and I'm tempted to do that. What is a trial?
It's just a difficult time in your life at that moment.
Right. Right. It's just a different something. It's just a different experience that you're having, but it's external in nature. It's not something that you're personally tempted towards. It's just something that's happening to you as opposed to something that you're kind of involved in, which goes into the next statement. Sandra?
I think joy and trials come together because so much of life is like a trial because things are happening in our lives that the folks who do not have, I guess, who are not Christian,
They see the trials as a different, like a despair.
Right.
We don't go into despair, we handle it differently.
Right.
It's not something that we just totally forget everything. And we may for a time, but it's not long, because we remember and are joyful that we have this foundation.
Right.
And moving forward. So when we go through trials, we don't stay there. You know, there are some folks that just stay there.
Right.
And ultimately, some take it to the fullest, you know.
Yeah.
And they can't handle the things that happen to them, like the Christian.
Yeah, and I think what you touched on there is something that is almost a lie in the religious or in the world. People think that the Christian life is hard because it comes with certain trials and tribulations, and it does. It is difficult. But the myth is that if you're not a Christian, your life is easy and pain-free. And people who are not Christians face a lot of trials and tribulations in their own life. But as you mentioned, they don't have the reward to look towards, and they don't have the foundation to sit on. And so as a Christian, when he talks about trials and tribulations in James 1, he talks about it in terms of a positive. You have this, everybody's going to go through sufferings at some point. But the ability to perceive it differently, and I know he's talking about distinctly Christian persecutions, but the ability to perceive it differently and to see the end result of it helps us move through those trials and tribulations a lot easier than someone who's of the world. And I think all of that is kind of built up within this idea of James chapter 1. He also mentions right after that this is something that you should look at with patience. How do we normally think about patience? And we spent a long time on this first slide. We won't spend this amount of time with everyone.
It's like sitting in a room, watching your favorite TV program.
Or your unfavorite, your least favorite TV program, yeah.
Those kids
Did you have this experience at some point, or that was remarkably specific? Yeah, patience is, if you didn't hear Howard, it's like watching your favorite TV program and a bunch of kids running in the middle of it. That could be patience for some people. When we think of patience, though, we tend to think of it as just kind of this passive, hesitation. Like, I'm just going to sit here in this little room, as Howard mentions, and just let everything swirl around me. Is that how James talks about the idea of enduring things with patience?
I think he's talking about the level of maturity. Patience, in my mind, especially in a trial, equates to maturity, how you handle it. And
Right.
not succumb to it, to drift off into various temptations that might cause you to sin.
Right.
You have to be mature about the process.
Right. You have to be mature in handling these types of things and not just kind of bowing to it. So there is that idea of perseverance. I'm going to stand here, I'm going to stick it through, I'm going to do what I can to not bend to it. Yeah, exactly.
Patience doesn't mean you're trying my patience. It means endurance in this case.
Right.
Steadfastness. It's not, because it's not a, oh, this is droning on and on, but I'll be patient. Like
As most people do every Sunday morning for 3 hours
yeah,
at 10:45,
yeah.
11:30.
And that's not what he's getting at here. He's saying, look, if you can continue to, I think the inoculation point made about the military was an excellent point, because that's exactly what it is. Whenever you go through enough of these trials, you start to become desensitized to the fact that, well, look, trials are going to come, but I know what my response is going to be. I know I can get through this. The rain doesn't bother me anymore because I've been in it, and I know what it's like. So that's ultimately what that kind of endurance is.
That's true. I would agree with that to a certain extent, that at some point you just become numb to it. And that's a facet about everything in life. If you're exposed to something so many times, you're going to eventually become numb to it. And I agree with that to a certain extent. I think there's a little bit more to it. George?
Is this kind of the idea of self-control?
I think so. Are you talking about in the sense of perseverance and steadfastness?
Long-suffering.
Long-suffering? Yeah, I think so. The idea of patience and moving through it, kind of enduring it, yeah.
Well, Brady, let me clarify. I didn't mean be numb to it.
Right.
It's just that.
I love misquoting people, though. So.
Yeah, I know you. And so, but you know you're wet, you know you're cold, but you know you can get through it. That was my point.
Right. And I agree with that. And I think that's a correct application of this. The idea that, especially towards the long suffering that we talked about earlier, the long view of it, you know that you're going to get through it. I think what James has specifically, and that's an excellent point, but I think what James specifically is talking about here is not just enduring, but growing through it. And I think given the context of what he's talking about enduring and considering his joy and seeing the long suffering and seeing the growth of your perseverance, he's talking about not just enduring something, but being able to thrive through it. And that's a little bit, that sounds very Joel Osteen, that sounds very televangelist, but that's, I think, the idea here. Because on the other end of trials, what should we look like as Christians? You go through the most painstaking endurance, perseverance moment of your life, what should you look like on the other end as a Christian, Howard?
We should be able to look and see our growth.
Right.
The plus things
Right.
have come out of it.
Right. That things, it wasn't just that you sat in a room and you kind of endured it for a period of time and you had perspective of the long term, but that through the midst of those persecutions that comes to everybody, you come out a stronger Christian on the other end. And I think that's what he's dealing with here when he talks about this maturation process, because he mentions right there in verses 3 and 4, and Paul would talk about this in a little bit in Romans 5, but he says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance then have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So the idea is not just to endure something, but to grow through that. And I think that's really what he's diving into when he talks about this idea of endurance. Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments on that?
I think it's important that we show that trait not just to the people around us, but in our family life. I can't imagine the damage that's done to children by parents that just have no self-control.
Right. Parents that, or people for that matter, but specifically parents who are going through a tough time and they just kind of shut down. And they're alive on the other end, but there's just kind of that gloom, that dark period in their lives. And not everybody deals with persecution or endures in the same way, but I think sometimes that's what happens, is we just kind of knuckle down and then we look back at that and we think, well, nothing really happened in those time periods.
Parents that just overreact at the slightest thing.
That's true.
And their kids are watching that.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to grow up the same way, and that's all.
Yeah, that's true. The literal word, the Greek word for this, it has to do with an active verb. And that's why I keep kind of bring back to it, is it has to do with an active verb. It's not something that we're just kind of, passively doing. It's something that we're continually moving towards. Yeah.
I don't know if this is, anyway, living on a gym, I have my life. I see guys where churches that no gain, no pain.
Yeah.
And you can see this parallel in this. And if we don't suffer out of the Christian, there's no gain to it.
Right. I mean, there might be a little gain here and there, but as you mentioned with working out, which are a much better example of that than I am, I've seen the pictures, but the idea of gaining something comes through conflict, comes through tension, comes through breaking down things and building new things out of it. And so that's the same way that he's talking about. Unless there's pain, there's not going to be much gain. The idea that this is used oftentimes in literature, this word is used in ancient literature, has to do with the idea of a guy standing underneath a big boulder. That's why you have it up there, where he's just kind of standing underneath a big boulder and he's just kind of enduring it, but he's continually pushing it forward. It's the idea of growing towards it. The big question is, as you look at patience, as you look at trials and temptations, the big question is why? Why should we endure through these types of things? We've talked about it a little bit so far, but why should we endure through these things?
I think Dustin hit it on the head when he pointed out that it makes us more in the image of Christ. We talk about baptism quite a bit, and the reason that it's essential is because that's how you participate in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ from Romans 6. Well, in order to participate in the sufferings of Christ, which is the exact point Dustin made, if you're going to be in the image of God, if you're going to be in the image of Christ, as Romans 8 points out, then you've got to take on these sufferings, but you've got to endure them. You can't let it destroy you.
Right. And Jesus would reference that most oftentimes in the upper room scene where he discusses the idea that persecution is going to come. Persecution is going to happen. It's just going to be there. The question is how you get through that, how you thrive through that, how you grow towards that. And all of that, as you mentioned, goes back to what Dustin mentioned earlier about being made and fashioned in the image of Christ. And I think that goes to, ironically, my first point, because of what it produces inside of yourself. It's not just about being this passive Christian that just kind of shows up on Sunday and Wednesday and sings songs and we go home and we maybe read our Bible once a decade. It's the idea of growing towards Christ and producing us ultimately, given what we just talked about last quarter of our Sunday morning class, ultimately producing in us a disciple. I want you to look at Luke chapter 21 real quick. Look at Luke chapter 21. This is near the end of Jesus' life. It's in that, I think that last week. Yeah. It's in that last week of Jesus' life. He's talking about persecutions that are going to come. He talks about persecutions on a grand scale. And then he jumps to verse 12. Look in Luke chapter 21 and verse 12. He says, before all these things, they will lay their hands on you, will persecute you, delivering to the synagogues and persons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. I think that's a little bit what we're talking about, verse 13. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. That's a Holy Spirit promise, by the way. We should all study our Bibles. I've heard people using that as a reference not to. Verse 16, but you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, yet not a hair on your head will perish. Verse 18, but then listen to verse 19. If you highlight or underline, this is a fantastic verse. By your endurance, you will gain your lives. What does he teach there in Luke chapter 21? Right. What he says in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. 2 Timothy chapter 4, the crown of life is not only just for me, but also who else?
Any who love his appearing.
Any who have loved his appearing. I fought the good fight, I finished the course. There's this idea of endurance that's all throughout the New Testament, but ultimately what it produces in us is that this idea of the image of Christ, the strength to get through these types of things. I would argue to you too as well that the alternative to persevering through these things is sin. Ultimately, when we bow to temptation, ultimately when we recant Christ in the moment of trial, what are we doing? Turning our backs on God, exactly. And Peter would know a lot about that. Who else would know a lot about that? That's where you started our class with. Somebody say Judas? That's an excellent illustration. Yes, Judas would be kind of the poster child for this. Yeah. What about James? What did James do? Before he became a Christian, what was he? He didn't believe in Jesus, exactly. And I think that's what makes his background so paramount to understanding this book. The alternative is sin. James knows this very well, which I think is one of the reasons he doesn't describe himself necessarily as Jesus, just as a bondservant of Christ. I'll tell you too that it shows a lack of maturity. It's the mark of maturity when we persevere, when we move through these types of things. That's really what James is getting at. When you look at James as a whole, the entire book ultimately gets toward is this idea of a perfect Christian. You see it here in James, the first chapter, when he says, let patience have its perfect work. There's all these references to perfection throughout the book of James. What does he mean when he says, I want to make you a perfect Christian? Or he alludes to the fact that he wants to make you a perfect Christian.
Complete.
Complete, what does that mean?
Perfect.
No, you're not wrong. We can continue this all day, by the way.
Now you're built up to be able to withstand all temptations and also present yourself as a person following God and accepting to God.
Right.
Everybody else.
Theoretically, you'll be able to endure every type of persecution. That only doesn't always happen, but theoretically we would be able to, yeah. And I think what you mentioned there at the end is probably the part that I was at least going towards, which is that we project ourselves and present ourselves as a Christian, somebody who follows after Christ. That goes back to what Dustin mentioned, that goes back to what Zach alluded to. But a perfect Christian is not somebody who is flawless. A perfect Christian is somebody who what?
He's trying to be Christ-like.
Is trying to be Christ-like, exactly. James knows that's not going to always happen. He knows that temptation is going to come, that we're going to fall to it. But the idea is to pick ourselves back up, which goes back to Luke chapter 22. When Jesus talked to Peter about him denying him 3 times, in the very next breath, what did he say to him? When you're restored, I want you to what? Well, that's John 21, but you're right. That'd be a couple days later, yeah. When you're restored, I want you to what? Strengthen your brother. I thought Debbie was going to get that. He's been on fire today. But yeah, I want you to strengthen your brother. This is what it looks like to fall. This is what it looks like to pick yourself back up. Peter knows intimately what that's about. And I think James kind of touches on this throughout the idea of the perfect Christian. If you look in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 10, which you don't necessarily have to, there's a phrase mentioned there in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 10 that Jesus was made perfect by his sufferings. What does it mean when it says that Jesus was made perfect by his sufferings?
Complete.
Anybody from this section like to answer about perfection? It's like a wave that's just coming across. Yes, Jesus was complete, but what does that mean when it says that he was made perfect by his sufferings? Zach, go ahead.
Well, it's the idea of executing something fully, of finishing some kind of course or finishing some kind of race.
Right.
That he has completed what he had set out to do, and by doing that, he leaves an example for others to follow.
Right. He came to this earth not only to teach, not only to live, but also to die. And so that death, burial, and resurrection is The sufferings, which I think he's alluding to specifically there in Hebrews chapter 2, that suffering and that death is what fulfilled or completed Howard, his mission. And so including that in our mindset, when he talks about us being a perfect Christian, it's the same type of idea. What are we built as humans to be? Not following after our own lusts and doing whatever we feel like. As human beings, what are we built to be? Pleasing towards God. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, built for good works so that we can walk in them. Hebrews talks about that. Our purpose in this world is not to simply exist and have as much fun as we want to, although that's fine too to a certain non-sinful extent. Our purpose on this earth is to be molded in the image of our Creator. That goes back to Genesis 1, make man in my image. That means a lot. And so when he talks about it in this sense, the idea of perfection, it has to do with that rounding out, that completion of our mission. I think all of that is embodied within that. Jump to James chapter 5. I did not plan this time appropriately. But look at James chapter 5, because I think this makes a fantastic bookend to what we spent the majority of our class discussing. James chapter 5, he then touches on this idea of patience, endurance, persecution. He says in chapter 5 and verse 7, "Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of our Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and the late rains. You too be patient," verse 6, "strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured. You have observed the endurance of Job, have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful." James 5, 7 through 11 is a perfect bookend to what he discusses in the first three verses of James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. What type of people? He brings up three people in James chapter 5. Who are they? As kind of examples of perseverance. Who does he bring up in James 5? Farmers, exactly. That's the first one. Why does he bring up farmers? Well, some of them did, yeah. Most of them probably were farmers to a certain extent, yeah.
There was nothing the farmers could do to make the crops come forward.
Right, I've learned that since I've really gotten to taking care of my lawn and eliminating all the weeds. There's nothing you can do to kind of speed up the process as much as you want. Why else does he bring up farmers?
Because although they're working all of the time to get this crop to grow and to grow
Right.
they do have to ultimately continue to endure through all of that to see that fruit at the end.
Right. You endure, and that's, I think, exactly what he talks about in James 5. He talks about the endurance. You, even though you plant the seed at the beginning, you still have to work, you have to till the ground, you have to do all these different types of things. But who does he rely on in James chapter 5, verse 7? The rains, which come from what? God. Exactly. And there's, by the way, an allusion to when you talk about Elijah, where Elijah prayed that it would not rain. It's kind of a nice little parallel effect. But he's still relying on God. The early rains, which kind of cement the seed, the late rains, which bring it to fulfillment. But there's nothing you can do to kind of speed up that process. What else? Who else does he bring up in James chapter 5? The judge, yeah, that's more of a specific entity. You're right. That's not who I was thinking of, but that's exactly right. Who else does he bring up as an example of endurance? Job, that's number 3, but you're right. Somebody said right here. The prophets, whoever it was, good job on that one. Right, he brings up the prophets. Why does he bring up the prophets? He mentions that in verse 10. Take the prophets, for example, he says.
Because they are a perfect example of having to endure a lot on behalf of the Lord.
Right. The persecution shifts, or the idea shifts in James chapter 5 from just being endurance to endurance with persecution layered over the top of it. Now there's a spiritual component to it. And so he brings up prophets who spoke the word of the Lord in the midst of all his persecution, who endured at the end of it. Who's the last person that he brings up? Job, exactly. Why does he bring up Job? Job is the one we always remember, because he's the most specific. Why does he bring up Job in verse 11? He lost everything, exactly. Now he got sons and daughters and riches at the end. That doesn't make up, by the way, for the kids that were gone. And I think that's a horrible application from that passage. But why does he bring up Job in this instance? He endured, and especially kind of with a religious overtone to it, trying to affirm his righteousness. But why does he bring up Job in verse 11?
Because despite the fact that through it all, you can definitely see his questions and his doubts and all of that. By the end of it, he says, okay, I see where I'm finite and wicked and sinful, and you are God. I get that, and I should shut my mouth because of that. And through that all, he didn't just say, well then fine, if you're not going to tell me, then fine, I'm done, I'll curse you and die then.
Right.
He had that option all through there, but he didn't. And at the end of it, as far as we know, he was still pleasing to God through it all, so.
Yeah, and and that's exactly right, the more I look at Job, the more I see it as, the more I'm amazed at the depth of it. Because when you look at Job, it's kind of the anthem for every persecuted Christian. And if you think of Job's friends as not necessarily being humans, they are humans, I don't doubt that at all. But if you think of them as being the voices in your head, you're wrong, you sinned, you did all these different things, and then Job's response is back to it, no, I'm not. It kind of represents that internal dialogue that would sometimes happen. And if you remember at the beginning of Job, Job's wife had the answer to everything. What did she ask him to do? Curse God and die. End the whole thing right now. That is the option that Zach was talking about. It's always there, but he did not take that option at any point during that week. Why? What did he know from all of it? One thing he held on to. Sorry.
That God was with him and ultimately he was out, right?
That God is compassionate, that He's merciful, that He's loving, that He's with him, that He's righteous. If we hold on to that, what does verse 11 teach us? What does he say about the Lord in verse 11? He's compassionate, He's merciful. We know at the end of our sufferings, the end of our trials and our tribulations, we know that God is there. He's with us through it, but He's also there at the end of it too. Those are powerful statements. And so when he brings up these three entities, he doesn't just pick people out of thin air. He's trying to get us to see the nature of persecution and our attitude through those things.
We still, in our modern day, we still talk about the question.
Right. Yeah, we still need to look to Him as kind of our guidance for that, because it's too easy to just kind of curse God and die. Maybe not outright, but it's still kind of easy to just kind of curse Him and die. Yeah, Sandra?
If their God is with us always.
Right.
And he faces trials and tribulations, whatever it is, we feel alone.
Right.
And we're not.
Well, and if you think about Job, that's what his friends were saying all along. The reason this happened to you is because God is against you. You sinned, and God's against you. Job the whole time was maintaining, God is with me because I haven't sinned. And so if you take that concept and put it in a Christian persecution idea, it's the exact same thing. We tend to think that because we're going through trials and tribulations, we tend to think that God's against us, when in reality we know, based on our obedience, that God is with us. That's what we hold on to. That's where the end of verse 11 comes to full view. He's full of compassion, He's merciful. But as Lee mentioned, it's not just that He's compassionate and merciful, but He also throws on this thing that He says, at least a couple of times here in James 5, that the Lord is near. Why does He remind us that the Lord is near? There's two reasons. Gives us strength, yeah. For the Christian, it reminds us that the Lord is near in terms of strength. He's always there, He's always present. For the non-Christian, for the unfaithful, what should that signal to us? Judgment, exactly. That even though I may do what I want now, the Lord's always there. And He sees what we're doing. He sees how we handle this persecution. Yeah. Somebody else have any thoughts or comments? Yeah, Zach?
There's a quote that I heard that I thought was kind of appropriate to what we've talked about so far, being endurance and patience when things look really dark and grim. And that's that the teacher is silent when the test is being given.
It's true.
And so sometimes if you feel like, this is getting dark and don't feel like God's near, just know that He's prepared you for this through what He's given. And if He answers it for you, then it's not you taking the test. You're not the one proving anything.
Right.
And so that's what all of this is about.
Right.
He's trying to see what your character is. What are you made of?
Right. And that is noticeable considering throughout the vast majority of the book of Job, God is silent. He speaks at the end, but for the majority, He lets Job kind of sort it all out by himself. That's a great point. Right. Fear God and keep His commandments. That's the very base. Yeah, great point. All right, we'll pick up with verse